The nobility ate roasted swan and sugared almonds and died of gout at 50. The peasants, eating gray bread and pea stew, built the cathedrals, harvested the grain, and outlasted every empire their lords swore would last forever. Turns out, food that kept you working 14 hours a day in a field was better engineered than food designed to impress a king. Here's what they ate. Here's why it worked, and here's why the cheapest food in medieval Europe still outperforms most of what's on your grocery store shelf. Chapter 1. The Peasant Strength Paradox. Skeletal remains don't lie. When archaeologists analyze medieval peasant bones, they find something that doesn't fit the narrative of grinding poverty and malnutrition. Bone density that rivals modern athletes. Muscle attachment points so pronounced they indicate sustained physical output that would be considered elite performance today. These were not weak people. A peasant laborer during harvest season needed 3,500 to 5,000 calories a day. They got it almost entirely from complex carbohydrates and fermented liquids. No protein shakes, no vitamin supplements, no meal timing windows. They ate what was cheap, what kept, and what they could make themselves. And they performed physical work from sun up to sundown doing it. The food wasn't peasant food because it was inferior. It was peasant food because the rich couldn't be bothered to understand what they were eating. Chapter 2. Peas Pottage, the 9-days-old stew. You've heard the nursery rhyme. You never knew it was describing one of the most nutritionally sophisticated survival foods in European history. Peas pottage was a thick, perpetual stew built from dried yellow peas, beans, and whatever herbs were growing in the kitchen garden. The pot sat on the hearth continuously. Every day you added water, added scraps, added more peas. Every day you ladled some out. The fire never fully went out. Neither did the stew. Here's what matters. Dried legumes contain the essential amino acids that bread is missing. Wheat gives you incomplete protein. Peas fill the gaps. Together, peas pottage and maslin bread formed a complete protein source without a single piece of meat touching the bowl. Medieval peasants didn't know the term complementary proteins. They just knew the combination kept them standing. The perpetual nature of the pot wasn't laziness, it was food science. Continuous heat suppressed bacterial growth. The slight fermentation that developed over days increased bioavailability of nutrients. The older the pot, the more complex the flavor, the more efficient the nutrition. 9 days old wasn't a warning, it was a quality indicator. A week's worth of peas pottage costs roughly $2 in dried split peas today. In medieval terms, it cost almost nothing, which is exactly why the poor ate it and the rich looked down on it. The rich were wrong. Chapter 3. Maslin Bread, the Everything Loaf. The white bread obsession nearly destroyed the nutritional foundation of Western civilization, and we're still recovering from it. Medieval peasants couldn't afford to separate wheat from rye. They couldn't afford to sift out the bran and germ, so they didn't. They baked everything together, wheat, rye, bran, germ, all of it, into a dense, dark loaf called maslin that lasted days without going stale and delivered nutrition that modern enriched bread can't touch. The math is ugly. Modern enriched white flour removes roughly 80% of the nutrients present in a whole-grain medieval loaf. Then manufacturers add back a fraction of the synthetic versions and call it enriched. Enriched means they took out $1's worth of nutrition and put back a nickel. Maslin bread had a low glycemic index because the bran slowed glucose absorption. It was loaded with B vitamins because the germ was still intact. It had fiber that fed gut bacteria, which medieval peasants didn't have a name for but benefited from constantly. The dense, heavy texture that made it poor food was actually the mechanism of its effectiveness. The difficulty of digesting it was the point. The rich ate white bread and crashed. The peasants ate maslin and kept working. The cathedrals got built by the people eating the gray bread. Chapter 4. Small Ale, the Liquid Bread. Every man, woman, and child in medieval Europe drank ale. This sounds like a historical curiosity until you understand why, and then it sounds like the smartest public health decision in pre-modern history. Water killed people. Rivers ran through livestock fields and human settlements with no separation and no treatment. Drinking untreated water in a medieval town was a reliable way to contract cholera, typhoid, dysentery, or any number of waterborne pathogens that had no cure. The peasants figured out, through brutal trial and error over generations, that fermented grain beverages didn't make people sick. They didn't know about pathogen kill rates during fermentation. They just knew that people who drank ale survived, and people who drank the river water often didn't. Small ale was very low alcohol, roughly 1 to 2%, enough fermentation to kill the pathogens, not enough to impair a person spending 12 hours behind a plow. It was unfiltered, which meant it carried live cultures and probiotics in every pint. It provided 150 to 200 liquid calories per serving. It kept for weeks without refrigeration. A laborer might drink a gallon a day during heavy work. That's 600 to 800 calories just from the ale before food. Liquid calories, hydration, electrolytes, and pathogen-free water all in one vessel. Modern sports science would describe this as a functional beverage. Medieval peasants called it breakfast. Chapter 5. Frumenty, the Morning Power Bowl. Before overnight oats became a $14 option at a cafe that smells like scented candles, there was frumenty, and frumenty was better. Cracked whole wheat berries soaked overnight, then simmered low and slow in milk until they broke down into a thick, porridge-like consistency, sweetened with honey when honey was available, dried fruit when it wasn't, almond milk during Lent when the church prohibited dairy, and peasants adapted without complaint because adaptation was the entire skill set of medieval survival. The slow-cooked whole grain delivered a sustained glucose release that kept blood sugar stable for hours. The magnesium content was significant. Magnesium supports muscle function and nerve transmission, which matters enormously when your entire morning involves physical labor. The protein from the milk combined with the complex carbohydrates from the wheat to create a breakfast that front-loaded energy for the hardest working hours of the day. This was engineered food, not by scientists in a lab, but by generations of people who paid close attention to what kept them functional and what didn't. Frumenty survived for centuries because it worked every morning it was made. The modern equivalent with the same nutritional profile costs less than 30 cents a serving in bulk whole wheat berries and milk. The cafe version costs $14 and uses processed oats and agave syrup. One of these is better. You know which one. Chapter 6. White Meats, the Dairy Gap. Meat was expensive. Meat required animals. Animals required land. Land was controlled by the same people who owned everything else. A peasant family might eat actual meat a handful of times a year. What filled the protein and fat gap the rest of the time was what they called white meats: butter, soft curds, and hard cheese. Hard cheese was the survival food nobody talks about in this context. Suffolk cheese, one of the most common peasant varieties, was so dense and dry that contemporary sources compared it to wood. Sailors used it as ballast. People joked you needed a chisel to cut it, and it lasted for months at room temperature without refrigeration because moisture removal and salt concentration created an environment nothing could survive in. Sound familiar? The Mongols solved the same problem with meat. Medieval peasants solved it with milk. Two completely different cultures, separated by thousands of miles, arrived at the same answer independently. Remove the moisture, add salt, and time does the rest. Butter was caloric density. Soft curds were fast protein. Hard cheese was the long-term reserve that sat on the shelf until it was needed. Together, white meats delivered the fat-soluble vitamins and complete protein that the grain-heavy diet couldn't provide alone. The peasant food system was a complete nutritional matrix. Every component handled something the others couldn't. Nothing was wasted, nothing was redundant. This wasn't accident. This was 800 years of iterative problem solving by people who died if they got it wrong. Chapter 7. What this actually costs. Here's the number that should make you angry. A full 3,000-calorie medieval peasant day. Peas pottage, maslin bread, small ale, Frumenty in hard cheese costs approximately 45 cents in bulk ingredients. Dried peas, whole grain flour, a small amount of dairy, salt, and water. That's it. A modern military MRE delivering the same caloric load costs $12, and the MRE has a worse nutritional profile. More sodium, lower fiber, fewer live cultures, no whole grain, no fermented liquid component. You're paying $12 for an inferior product because it comes in a foil pouch and has a brand name on it. Scale this out. A 30-day supply of medieval staples for one person runs approximately $15 in bulk. The commercial freeze-dried equivalent runs $250 minimum. The gap isn't a little, the gap is embarrassing. The industrial food system didn't replace medieval peasant food because it was better. It replaced it because it was faster to produce, cheaper to manufacture at scale, and easier to sell to people who had been told that cheap food was inferior food. The peasants were poor. The food wasn't. Chapter 8. Why We Forgot. The Industrial Revolution needed workers who ate fast. Factories ran on shift schedules that had no room for perpetual pots, slow fermented ale, and stone-ground bread. Processed food wasn't a conspiracy, it was an optimization for a different problem: feeding people quickly in an urban environment that had no hearths, no gardens, and no time. The problem is, we solved the speed problem and then forgot to go back for the nutrition. Modern enriched flour removes 80% of the nutrients in a standard Maslin loaf and replaces them with synthetic fractions of what was lost. Modern processed food eliminates fermentation entirely and replaces it with shelf-stable chemistry. Modern diet culture spends billions of dollars selling supplements that replace what whole grain, perpetual legume stew and fermented grain beverages provided for free for 8 centuries. The peasants weren't food scientists. They were people paying close attention to what kept them alive, and they got very good at it. We stopped paying attention. We're paying for it now, not in shillings, but in chronic inflammation, poor gut health, metabolic dysfunction, and a supplement industry worth $150 billion that exists to sell back what we threw away. The information isn't lost, it's just inconvenient. Don't forget to subscribe.